Anyway, Sumaiya is a very good friend of mine, and when I requested her that she does this talk for us, and she immediately agreed. And just to give her a brief introduction, because we are already behind schedule, our schedule starts. So I'll just give a brief introduction about Sumaiya from her own website, and which says that she's an Australian neuroscientist with a PhD in medicine neurophysiology from Sydney, and currently holds a postdoctoral fellowship in Sweden. She has also conducted teaching for years 1 to 2 MBBS at Western Sydney University for over 5 years. While her previous research was in mechanisms of pain psychology, she is now studying the neuroscience of violent aggression in humans. It is conducted using techniques from biological psychiatry, neurophysiology, human behavior, genetic and hormonal profiling, and brain imaging. She has developed a laboratory paradigm to access and differentiate between the propensity to engage in retaliatory versus appetitive aggression, a quantifiable violent behavior, the latter closely mimicking violent extremism. She has conducted several interviews with people who have engaged in ideological, for instance, violent extremism, and non-ideological acts of violence, to study the biopsychosocial, as she called it, biopsychosocial basis of appetitive violence, a rewarding motivational violent behavior most commonly observed in terrorists. She is a consultant neuroscientist for de-radicalization and countering violent extremism measures. She's also the editor of Science on fact-checking on the fact-checking portal Alt News, which is run by Pratik Sinha, as everybody knows. And she's also an author of a book called India Misinformed. She's a co-author of that book, if I'm not wrong. And she's the author of several scientific articles. Her next book, which is titled Violent Brains of Ordinary Individuals, which I think shortly will be launched. And the science behind ordinary, I think the book talks about the science behind ordinary people committing violent crime. Even this lecture is all about that. How do you understand the mind of a perpetrator of violence? It's not possible to understand it like Robert Sapolsky had written in that book which I read. He says that you can't, if you're trying to understand this human behavior through psychology or childhood trauma or culture, it's not possible, because all these things are intertwined, and we need a kind of biological approach to understand all these things, because if you invoke one, you're invoking all. I think more on it, Sumaiya will be able to explain it better. So over to you, Sumaiya. Thanks a lot once again for joining.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting. It's been a great pleasure. As Faisal said, that this is going to be a completely different presentation or talk from whatever you've ever experienced, because of the focus on the science and scientific research methods. This is very much a quantitative and not qualitative research. So we do rely on data, we do rely on a lot of evidence, which is empirical, based on our observation repeatedly. However, there are lots of photos and videos for you to see. So it's not just graphs and numbers. So you can actually see the impact of behavior manipulated by something that changes in the brain. We're specifically talking about violence, but because violence is just one of the behaviors that is so commonly found from every species. We're talking about cats and dogs and mice and humans, birds and insects, everybody. So because it is such a evolutionarily preserved behavior, just like feeding, procreation, sleeping, and all these other activities, the systems that enable this behavior of violence are actually preserved throughout the evolutionary process. So it's not a unique thing to humans only, but for example, the scientist Jane Goodall, she spent more than 30 years. Robert Sapolsky, as Fez pointed out, he had spent a long period of time living in South America and in Africa to just observe how monkeys behave in aggression and how are their social kind of interactions based on what is considered violent or aggressive and what is not. Just to give you a little bit of a basic kind of background. So the type of violent behavior that I'm discussing here, the reason that is very similar to the extremist and the terrorist kind is is because of its motivational quality. It's because the extremist violence, whether it's a suicide bombing or shootings in the schools or shootings in the mosque in Christchurch, lynchings on the street, or a neo-Nazi behavior where a group of very young kids gather together and just, their Sunday activities are going from synagogue to synagogue, mosque to mosque, targeting people who go to these specific places of worship that are considered, evil in the neo-Nazi ideology. So these activities are these reward-seeking, unprovoked type of violence acts, and the reason why I'm saying it's a reward-seeking, motivational type of violence and it's unprovoked is because it's very different from the retaliatory violence most commonly found in individuals, and that's often more acceptable in our societies. And because of the retaliatory aggression is more like a tit for tat, something goes wrong and one person hits the other person hits back. And so and I'm talking about immediate retaliation, at that particular point, not planning something 10 years later. So that would be considered unprovoked in a way. You want to do something after that period is already passed. You moved ahead of it. So this type of motivational violence that I speak of is rooted in reward. The terrorists in particular, or the people who go on and lynch people on the streets and do all sorts of activities, which is like genocide or pogrom or whatever that you call, they derive a certain type of pleasure in the process. You will often find these people boasting about it, of some of the things that they've not even done. And all these peoples show a lot of pride in the process. And that's a specific type of violence that we're looking at. Someone who enjoys doing what they're doing boasts if they think that there is a higher moral or social value to that. It is being celebrated in the peers. And finally, the reward is the reward itself. The reward is not money or power. The reward is the reward itself, especially for the person who's engaging in aggression. You can say outfits like ISIS and Al Qaeda have a lot of reward of power and world domination and that kind of stuff. But for the person who's engaging in it, the suicide bomber, the shooter, the lyncher, for them, the immediate reward is just getting the pleasure of the action itself at that point in time. That's what's being celebrated. So that's just the background of it. And I'll go on and say why it's related to your brain and why we should be looking there. But that's the kind of violence that we want to explore. And the other thing is that I would keep saying aggression because aggression is the actual behavior. Violence is the phenomenon that happens because of the aggression. And aggression is the behavior, and that's also something which is quantifiable, measured. Violence cannot be measured or even replicated to see the effects of it. So just a little bit of a background and what's called what. But at any point in time, if you don't understand something, please give me a shout out and I will explain it to you. So also, my interest in doing some of these things. I have been, a global citizen for the longest period of time. I've born in Gujarat. I lived in Gandhinagar for most of my childhood. And after 2002 happened, we left to go to Australia. Then I grew up in Sydney, finished my high school, finished my undergraduation, post-graduation and PhD. And then after my PhD finished, I moved here in 2015 in Sweden. And now in Sweden, I have been living in this place called Linköping, which is here. It's right in the middle on this lake. We're in the middle of Stockholm and Gothenburg. It's kind of equidistant from both. This is just to give you an idea of where we are. Because Sweden's something, most people think it's Switzerland, but it's not. We're way up north. So this is where I am at the moment. Of course, my family lives back in Australia. There's very little family back in India. I do visit on and off but we lost our home in the drought. We lost our relatives. Most of the immediate relatives don't live there. So that's just a bit of understanding, what my background is, what my motivation to do this. And some of these aspects of my identity will reflect in the way that I do research, and that's why I just like to put it out there. So even though my dad was actually from South Africa, so I have a little bit of a coastal culture in our life. So moving on. This is my hospital, and this is where I am, and it's one of the biggest employers in the region of the Auckland, which is my county. And I am in the Department of Psychiatry. It's a teaching hospital. I don't teach anymore, but it is a teaching hospital. And I'm in the center called the Center of Social and Affective Neuroscience. And the reason I'm putting this here is that the other and biggest employer in my city or in my county is actually Saab. And Saab is the producer of fighter jets and military equipment, and sells military equipment to all over the world. Despite that, Sweden has a very pacified military, and Swedish military mostly does surveillance and a very relaxed form of military because of the way the political situation is. There's not a lot of investment in the military in the same way as it is in the U.S. or China or other parts of the world, or India for that matter. So, but they do export a lot of their military equipment, and it's walking distance literally from my house, where the facility is manufacturing of Saab. And also, they used to make cars, but they don't make cars anymore. It's just fighter jets that India was going to buy at one point in time. So there's a huge difference between the military, which is known for the biggest job of the military is to act on warding off enemies using violence. But the other side is the research that happened here. So there's a bit of a kind of a dual how do you say face of this, that one side of the Sweden is very pacified, but the other one is not. But in general, when we talk about criminality and what is called a criminal or what is called a violent actor, we generally think of those people as very there's something wrong with them. We think that they must have some sort of a major mental illness. And most people who engage in this stuff, especially those coming from the ISIS, and we see these really heinous acts of people being murdered in a very specific way, and we would think that no normal person would actually engage in that type of violence, and there must be something super wrong with them. And because the religion, Islam uses an ideology to support that type of behavior, people will generally attribute that behavior to Islam and say that if you're brainwashed enough to this extent, using the book, using Quran, using all the texts of the Islamic teachings, and then you can be brainwashed. And by that definition, everybody who is actually a religious person or a real believer must be similar to what the ISIS is in the behavior. Where this is what I am here to break the bubble of. So this is exactly what I'm going to counter in this talk. And it's not just about Muslims, it's also about other religions. Basically, every other person. Can a religious book dictate the behavior? What does it actually dictate the behavior of a person? And we've known throughout our research since the War of Terror started and before, the Syrian civil war is very recent, but way before 9/11 happened. And since that time, people have been fed that there are good apples and there are bad apples. And the good apples are not violent, not terrorists, and bad apples are the terrorist kind, the violent kind, and they must be violent in every phase of their life. They must be violent throughout, and they must be a really bad person. They must be a really bad person, and that's something that I'm going to also take down using the research that we're going to. So, but the 60s, 70s, who always thought, and even a lot of people now thought that these guys who are terrorists, these guys who kill people, murderers, are often different than the normal guys, and they're culturally different, possibly religiously different, but they're disturbed or they're just mentally ill. They must be diagnosed with some sort of a problem. And in psychiatry, we call that psychopathy. So there are three major disorders that potentially could lead to someone becoming very violent. So psychopathy, borderline personality disorder is one of the major ones. Sociopathy, which is also called psychopathy. So these kind of definitions are, I would say, very vague, because a lot of people kind of come on the spectrum as well. But the truly psychopathic people and the people who are actually in that domain, and I would say some of them are autistic as well. And I'm not saying people on the gradient, but the true autistic people and the extreme kind, the true psychopaths and the true personality disorder people are only less than 1% of the population. So if that is the case, less than 1% of the population is not engaged in terrorism or what we call extreme radicalization. A lot of people are violent in this world. So it is impossible that all these people that what we are seeing have engaged in this activity are actually mentally ill to this point. I'm not saying that there are none. There will be a lot of monsters, as you call them. And I'll give you an example of this guy who engaged in a terrorist attack in Europe. His name was Omar Mateen, and he was American. He was from from New York, and he did one of the worst type of shootings in this nightclub of Orlando. And he had this extreme personality, and all his peers and people who knew him. I can hear my own voice.
Yeah, there is an echo, right?
Yeah, maybe someone needs to mute. Okay, now it's fine. So this Omar Mateen was, American. He used to be this extremely homophobic, extremely conservative type of person from the childhood. There was this monster type of profiling done on him. He was very unhinged, very impulsive. Went off the handle very quickly. And in my experience in interviewing, more than 35 odd jihadis and neo-Nazis, and some of them also Hindu extremists who engaged in Gujarat 2002, they're all, they're all very different to what this guy was. So when I studied Omar Mateen, I realized that he's one of the fringe. These type of violent, extreme personalities were the fringe. The majority of them were actually the norm, who were people just like you and I. And this is something that is extremely scary for most people, specifically those who study this behavior, because then you can't identify who is going to be who. You can't use psychology to determine or even predict someone's behavior. It's one of the scariest things that is out there, that even if we remove the psychopaths from the society, or we find out who they are, we still have these regular people engaging in mass violence. And one of these things were conducted by, I kind of just talked about these things. I'll go back to Omar Mateen again, because I want to talk about what some of the psychopathic traits are. So basically, these guys don't feel a lot of empathy or guilt or remorse. They don't have the capacity to do sound judgment. They have a specific type of empathy, which is they can see that the other person's feeling pain, but they can't relate to it. So it's a very different understanding of empathy. And they lack the very basis of what we call as a moral behavior, which is socially acceptable. But obviously, not everybody will have the full set of traits. Some would do, but only the true psychopaths that are that are less than 1% of the population would have all of these traits. So all of us would have a little bit of this or that, but you have to basically tick all the right boxes to be able to be labeled as that. And they're often recognizable, so that it's not unrecognizable. If someone knows a person enough, they can figure out who was a psychopath or a narcissist or sociopath. Is someone speaking? So
No.
right. So I know these guys are most likely to be involved in murderous crimes, and they're also more likely to engage in crime after committing the crime before. So they have a history. They don't stop. None of those incarceration works on them. So whether it's a juvenile system or whether they actually grow up and go to adult prisons, none of the imprisonment actually works as a deterrent. But in contrast to that, we have the non-psychopathic guys, people like you and I, people like us. They have a lot more. We have a lot more of normal people in the prisons who've committed those kind of violent, extreme violent acts. I'm not talking about petty crimes, but extreme violent acts. But even those guys have a risk or a percentage of what we call recidivism after being incarcerated around 40 to 60%. And these guys are also likely to get out of the prison and commit another violent crime. Now, I know I'm separating the behavior or just violent crime as opposed to the terrorist or extremist crimes because we're just talking about the behavior. There is no way neuroscience can answer for radicalization. And I'll come to that later, but essentially, whether it's a radicalization or based on ideology or based on anything that kind of drives you in terms of an idea, or whether it's religious or a political idea, people who study violent behaviors, they know that this is just a driver. The reliance on violence ideology often comes next. They have to be specifically primed for violence from the start. And when there is this recruitment process into the jihadist ideology, people know who are primed and who are not primed into for violence. So when there is a recruitment process, the recruiters, for example, the Al Qaeda recruiters or ISIS recruiters, they don't approach people. Majority of the recruitment now is done on the internet, and they never actually approach people. People approach them, and through the filtering system, which is like a step-by-step process of jihadist recruitment, people who are not cut out for violent behavior will actually get removed. And only those who get specifically picked, they know they've been primed for violence. They know they want something big. They want something that is rewarding, big, but engages in this type of violent activities. So throughout the process, it just seems like the recruiters of Al Qaeda or ISIS knows this type of science better than some of us, and that's why they're very successful in recruiting people. But going back to psychopathy and neuroscience, we have been able to see what's wrong in people using brain imaging, using a lot of other things, not just psychiatry analysis, but some of the stuff is brain imaging, and we've seen how people can be recognized. It's very easy not just to recognize the behavior, but also looking at their brain scans and see, what is psychopathic traits versus the normal ones are completely normal. So you can see the photo of the brain here. This guy is called Jim. He's a known psychopath, has been involved in other crimes, but you can see how there is a highlighting of all the areas of the brain, particularly the frontal lobe, which is in the red, and at the back, particularly the yellow one, which is at the front, and at the back you have the red area. How the red area, how the yellow area in the control, which is the normal population, is active and alive, and in Jim, which is psychopath, it's kind of bluish. And what that means is that the impulsive or more execution, the brain area responsible for the executive function, which is in a way the smarter part of the brain, is actually not functional to the same point as it should be. Now, this can be from birth or this can be acquired. It's basically damage or some type of damage to the frontal lobe of the brain. This area of the brain in humans has been developed over time through evolution. Now, if you look at the monkey brain or cat brain, that frontal area is the very brain area that is missing, or it is not, I wouldn't say missing in monkeys, but it is less developed. And that's why we humans are the kind of people that we are right now. Because this is one of the thickest or the biggest areas of the brain, and it's in a way taken over every decision, every action that we do. So whatever happens in the deep brain areas goes to the frontal lobe and then goes back. And this is where all the social judgment, the executive judgment, the impulse, the control of impulse, and all of that has been regulated from. And in people who don't have this regulation, people can say, a lot of these people who don't have this, very high impulsive drive, and they're very pragmatic people. They don't have a lot of empathy, and in some situations, or maybe in some professions, that might be a good thing. But if you remove one part of the system, you always give a con to because of the removal of that system. Because the con is then this person can have these psychopathic traits. So this guy who was a murderer obviously had a very different type of functional system, and you could see the differences between a regular person. Very little processing going on in the frontal area or the frontal temporal area. So the temporal lobe is about this size. So in this area particularly, there's very little conversation, talking between the two areas of the brain. The second way that you can actually get psychopathy is through injury to this area. Now, this is a very, very popular case. This guy's name is Phineas Cage. Ages ago, he used to work on the rail tracks, and the rail tracks had construction going on. So, they were using these materials to kind of blow up some of the areas. And during that process, a rod that he was working with, it went straight through his eye, through here, and came out from out. As you can see in the picture of the brain here, as you can see, the rod kind of went through here. And extremely popular, this skull of Phineas Cage is still preserved and kept in a museum. This guy was still alive right after this happened. You would think that it's a huge rod that has gone through. If it would have gone through here, he would have been dead instantly. But because it went through the eye and came out through here, poor Phineas Cage had lost some of his frontal lobe. The very moment something changed in the Phineas Cage, in the brain of the Phineas Cage, this guy became, completely devoid of empathy, completely devoid of emotions. He could not understand or read other people's emotions or what they were trying to say, and became extremely pragmatic, became hyper aggressive and violent. And his wife left him. He had a very bad life towards the end. But as it was very typical, and we had very little labor rights back then, or workers' rights, his boss said after the injury, "All right, Phineas, you've had a bad day. Go take a day off. Come back tomorrow, and hopefully things will be fine." So the guy went on to do whatever he was doing, but then eventually lost his job because he could not continue. So this guy is still, sorry about the music outside. This guy is still in the Harvard Medical School. His brain is still preserved. So that's the acquired psychopathy. So one of the things that we could also look at, which we use now, is the method called functional MRI. And functional MRI is basically magnetic resonance imaging. You guys do MRI, but just the functional side of it, which means that you're actually going through processes inside the MRI. You're acting on something, you're answering questions, you are clicking on stuff to play a specific type of a game or whatever behavior that you want to engage in, that evokes a specific type of the brain area that you want to highlight in the MRI. And because of the functionality, it's not like straight up camera shots. It is taken throughout a period of say half an hour, and then seen over time what are some of the areas being activated in the process. So you could see that in psychopaths, some of these areas that are being activated are completely different to the control subject. So you can see the C is the control and P is psychopath. You can see instantly how many areas are absent or lit, I would call, in psychopathic brain versus the control brain. So even when they're doing regular stuff like for example, in this case, there was a task of a moral dilemma. One of those tasks that are given to kids before medical school, where you choose to say one person, or would you choose 5 person because you need to change the track of the train. And either one is a problem, but which one's going to save less lives, and which one would you rather choose? So there are many tasks in this moral task program, but when they put the psychopaths versus the controls in the MRI, they obviously had very distinct activation patterns in the brain. So obviously we can kind of now understand that the emotions of the brain, the executive function, the empathetic part, and all of this has been regulated from the front of the brain. And because this area is so important, any damage in the area, whether it's due to an injury or an accident, or you're just born with a deficiency, and that could cause these people to behave in a certain way. But these are not everywhere. These are not the norm of the population. This is the fringe element. This is what we call the Omar McCains for the Orlando shooters. This is what we call some specific guys who would have done one of the worst type of acts of violence that we could never imagine, just for the pure pleasure of it. And this is this would not be rewarding in any way that it is for normal people. So one thing is very clear, that these guys, even though they enjoy doing what they do, it is not it's not in the same way as rewarding as it is for the normal people who engage in violence, the terrorists, for example. But it doesn't mean that the terrorists would not have psychopaths. One of the other cases is the first caliph of what previously was ISIL, and then IS now, the Islamic State in general. The first caliph who died in 2019, Baghdadi, and he had this very specific. Now, I haven't studied the brain. I don't know who he was. He had many identities, and he had hidden his names in so many ways. He was basically the invisible sheikh, as they would call him. But he had a very distinct type of personality, and I said, you don't need to put them under the MRI scanner always. You can easily detect who are who. He was involved in a lot of sex type of slavery, keeping girls in the Kurdish area of northern Iraq, Yazidi women, a lot of Yazidi women, but also a lot of other women as sex slaves. There were all these really heinous crimes that not everybody in the ISIS did. And why was this specific guy involved in these things? And under his direction, one of the worst type of, obviously ISIS became what it became. He was the founder from the offshoot of the previous Al Qaeda. But also, there's a very specific method that set the base for what ISIS is, this very heinous type of violent crimes that we've never seen in history. And it was under his direction that this happened, and a lot of people say that Hitler was also that kind of a psychopath that ended up killing Jews in a very specific way. It wasn't just any type of murder, it was this very heinous type of crime, gassing people, killing, people in tunnels, whether it's kids or young or old women, everybody who was unfit to live. And Baghdadi had a similar type of worldview. Majority of the people that he killed, most of them are Muslims. Most of them being affected are Muslims, and it is in his time that the most amount of displacement happened, the most amount of people got killed because of these crimes. So he has that kind of profile as well. He had a disturbed childhood. He was abandoned by his father, and he grew up as a very conservative. Even in his youth, he was very, very conservative and extremely backward. He grew up in a tribe in Iraq, and then he started to claim that he was a direct descendant of the Prophet, and through which and most people. He also went to Abu Ghraib, and he also went to Guantanamo Bay and got imprisoned. But in Guantanamo Bay, and this is a very typical about psychopaths, is that they hide their identities really well when they need to. And normal people who engage in this kind of crimes can't do it so effectively. So in Abu Ghraib, there was a very interesting thing that most people in Abu Ghraib thought he was just a regular worker, like he was some sort of an administrative assistant or a secretary, and he was on his card in Abu Ghraib. It said that he was a civilian internee. So no one found out that he was actually, one of the top person in back then the Al Qaeda, and then later on he would end up actually forming what called the offshoot of the Al Qaeda. Then later, what became the ISIL and IS as of now. So nobody even understood how he managed to do that. He was one of the most quietest people there, very social, very helpful otherwise. So this is very, this is very smart thing about the psychopaths. They know how to cover up behind them. They know how to wash their dirty towels. And regular people don't do that or can't do that in this particular way. So yeah, obviously, they're very different. There's something going on in their brain, but that's not what we're talking about. I'm just going to skip a little bit of this and talk about the regular people, which is what my research is about anyway. The reason I want to talk about this more interestingly is that we can't find any major psychiatric disorders in these guys. We can't find anything that is remotely close to, not MRIs, nothing in the scans, no psychiatric analysis. They're all normal, whether it's schizophrenia, autism, ADHD, depression, anxiety, personality disorders. I've done a lot. I've done, the majority of the people that I've studied, they've all cleared and have been perfectly healthy, and that's one of the most dangerous parts. In ISIS as well, these Omar Makis and these al-Baghdadis and these type of people, they're the fringe. If this is the norm, this is what we should be studying. Not the fringe. Of course we have to study the fringe, but they're very distinct in the way that they behave. But because majority of the foreign fighters have been going back and doing what they've been doing, and whether it's the neo-Nazis or in ISIS or in India and elsewhere, where you see a lot of people being violent instantly on the street for absolutely no reason and celebrating it afterwards. We must understand regular people's behavior. What are they? Can we and if we can't distinguish them using the techniques that we have, clearly poverty is not the one. Clearly economics is not the one. Radicalization is not the one. We in Canada and the US, I'm not sure if you guys know about this, there are outfits who do terrorism without any religious or geopolitical means. So this is completely unrelated to geopolitics and religious ideology. This is based on victimhood. These people feel that they're being victimized by the society, in particularly by women. They call a group of incels, and they've been carrying out attacks in Canada and the US. So we all question whether is ideology really the responsible bit, or you, by default, you get chosen through the ideology and your recruitment happens. And towards the end of it, in the last phase of recruitment, you get tipped over. Who decides you get tipped over? Can you train 100% of the population in an ideological way to go towards violence and terrorism? No, you will have only a small proportion and it will get filtered through. So who decides that small proportion in the end? It is your neurobiology. It is very much your brain. It is very much who you are inside. And that could be whether you're born this way, whether you have genetics in a specific way, whether you've been born as a psychopath, whether you've had psychopathy later on in your life, or whether you are just a completely normal person that has been, selected by a combination of a lot of biological factors to become who you are. And this is one of the most complicated ones because there is not an MRI that you can predict. There's not a psychiatric test that can predict this. So how can we predict this people's behavior? So, I call it appetitive aggression, appetite. And it comes from appetite, as in, the hunger and the need to be violent, which it's a very psychiatric term. You can use it, any other way as well. But so this extreme form of aggression in which you feel rewarded, and through your aggression, you feel happy about being aggressive. You feel good. It's pleasure given. It's got a combination of all of the other factors. We got anger, we got hostility, we got verbal aggression, and then we got the physical aggression. And it's often the physical aggression that can be measured. The other things cannot be measured in the same way. And what we say, this person is being angry, it's just an emotion. It's not behavior. You can't measure anger, but you can measure aggressiveness, which is the actual behavior. So I'm not going to say these guys are angry and then they're becoming violent. I would say anger is just one of the things that they keep inside. Of course they're angry, but it's not what causes the behavior all the time. So aggression of this particular type, again, it's not psychopathic. It's very primal, instinctive. You can see it in animals, and birds and mice, and all sorts of monkeys, and all sorts of these other non-human species. It's not instrumental. It's not a means to an end. You don't need to have power or sex to get this type of aggression. It's rewarding, of course. It's rooted in grievances. I think this is one of the most important bit. It's rooted in grievances. So there's another guy called Abu Huzaifa who was a foreign fighter from Canada. He came back from ISIS, and I spoke to him. And there was another neo-Nazi who actually organized the Charlottesville riots in the U.S. So very popular riots happened, and everybody was through the roof how much of the neo-Nazi ideology was actually in the American system. And these guys had very similar kind of behaviors. They both had engaged in violence. They both had been growing up with violence almost every single day as a part of pleasure-giving activity. But they were kind of normal as well at the same time. What people pick fights when they're children all the time. These guys were those type of people. They had very normal, privileged childhoods. They had nothing that would say uncomfortable. They had no poverty. But they always wanted something big for themselves. And this guy, I can't take the name of, he's in the US, he's affiliated with a major organization called, he's actually founder of a major organization called Identity Europa, the Nazi organization in the US. And then this other guy called Abu Huzaifa, obviously that's his ISIS name, we don't know the real name. Both very different, both grew up in a very privileged childhood. None of them had their parents who belonged to an ideology. Both of their parents did actually condemn the actions of them, but they both had certain type of grievances, not personal grievances, but grievances of those that they identified with. So Abu Huzaifa was completely normal. He just started, going online and checking out what was this about, why would Muslims, behead people? That was one of the biggest questions. And when he was exploring some of this, and he also had these questions like, if these guys were Muslims, were they even real Muslims in the first place? If you're a Muslim, why are you so violent? Because Islam doesn't teach you this type of violence. And the Nazi guy, he did not think of people as, he had this idea of white people as the supreme primal race, and he thought that everybody else should not exist, not at least in his country, or at least in, people should be where they are. So Chinese should be only in China, Indians should be only in India, and nowhere else. So that was his major worldview. So of course he was talking to me, and I looked like this, and I was in Sweden, the place that neo-Nazis used to push their narrative of ideology. That the Scandinavians or people who lived in Sweden like 1,000 years ago were the real Vikings, and they kind of imitate some of these cultural practices and also some of the ways that they used to look. But he didn't tell me on my face that I shouldn't exist here where I am. He made an exception to that, but as a general rule, he thought that Indians should be in India, Americans should be in America, or Europeans in Europe. So very, very distinct kind of ideologies, but also very similar in the end. What they wanted was extermination of people who were not like them at the end of the day. Grievances, were similar as well. One guy, the ISIS guy, had grievances because of the civil war, the Syrian civil war. That's when he decided he wanted to go to Syria and become the foreign fighter. So he was a normal guy, Canadian otherwise. His mother was an anesthetician. She did not have a veil on. She did not. The sister did not have a veil on. The father had some sort of a restaurant in Canada, in Toronto, and the same thing with the. I would call him NT, the neo-Nazi guy. He was otherwise middle-class family, Italian immigrants, very born in the U.S. but very, very American, very polite. One of the common things was, but the grievances were that the white people did not have enough as they are supposed to have, because a lot, he grew up close to the Silicon Valley. He grew close to San Francisco, and he could see a lot of the Chinese and the Indians and a lot of these other people of other race doing way better than him. So economically, he felt like this is his country, and then why are other people coming and doing better? So there's are some of these differences here. But I'm just going to show that this type of aggression, okay, I'm going to just pause for a moment. This particular type of aggression that is unprovoked, going back to the biology of it, we talk about these Abu Husaifas and NTs, but going back to the biology of it, we have been seeing that these types of aggressive behaviors or unprovoked, rewarding type of aggressive behaviors can be, turned on and off because we found these specific areas of the brain that are responsible for that behavior. And that area of the brain is very distinct to the psychopathic kind. We saw the psychopathic brain was much more here in the front. And if there was no activity here, the psychopath, so the person behaved like a psychopath, which is very different from a normal person. But here, I want to show you how this particular area of the brain, hypothalamus, which is, it's rooted, it does a lot of things. It's not just this type of aggression, but specific areas of the brain, how you can stimulate them using electrodes. And we pass electric currents into the brain in animals in particular. Obviously, we can't do that in humans, but we can obviously do brain scans like MRI. But here, because we want to do a manipulation, we want to see, because this area is responsible, and we see the psychopathic kind, this area, if it's responsible, if it's given enough amount of electrical current, not enough to kill, not enough to make them, damage them in any way, just that moment to stimulate the cells, because the cells in our brain are actually speaking to each other via proteins or electrical signals. And if we pass electricity, they might actually respond. And I just want to show you a video here. We stimulate that area of the brain and how the cat is going to react. And that's when you would know that this unprovoked type of behavior is so rooted in biology that we can literally turn it and turn off. So here's the cat with the electrode on it. Increase the simulator. Cat sitting, nothing's going on. Cat tries to hurt the other cat. So at the push of the button, a weak stimulus from a device implanted, connected, to the skull, implanted in the deep area of the brain, and what we call these areas, the hypothalamic circuit, can actually engage in this type of stimulation. As soon as we turn the button off, it's gone. So you can actually practically evoke such type of behaviors. And obviously you can't do that in humans because ethics, right? In animals, however, we've been using this type of stuff, particularly my collaborators have been using some of these type of techniques to manipulate these behaviors in mice that are bred in the laboratory, that are specifically responsible. They're specifically bred in a way that their genes are perfect, that they don't have any distinct genetic profile. So they all are bred, they're basically interbred in such a way that everything is constant. So they have no environmental differences, no genetic differences, and we still find like a subset of those animals behaving in this way, right? And this is a stimulation electrode in a healthy, regular cat, just to show that this brain area is responsible. But this is not a normally violent cat. As you can see, the cat was just normally sitting. This is the mouse. Okay, before I need to show you the context behind it. So this is that my collaborator's video in Seattle where the mouse is being used, and this wire that you see is going and stimulating via light. So this is like optically enhanced stimulation. This is not electrical current. So as soon as you turn the light on, the light is going to stimulate that area of the brain, which is going to make them attack. And then once you turn it off, it will stop attacking. So just go back again, light on. How quickly the behavior changes. Light off and it's gone. So you see, you can say that, oh, it's social, circumstances. Yes, it can be social circumstances. It can be so many different things. It can be just someone trying to, what people call in terms of terrorism, what they call, oh, we're fighting for our country, all of that. But you see how quickly you can change just by turning off a switch and turning on a switch. And these circuits over here, they've been evolutionarily preserved all the way from rats to humans. And in our brains, they have such a huge role. For example, things like fever and all of these basic biological functions are actually also from the hypothalamus. So if we can change our behavior in such a unique way, a complex behavior like aggression, we can get an animal to fight a glove in a laboratory by just turning on and turning off a light. I think it's very, very important to look in humans what we can change using this type of biology. Now, this is just a bunch of cells. I'm just trying to see my screen behind my laptop, a bunch of cells. I'm not going to talk about it, probably too much the science in there, and probably not good for the platform. But this is basically the way that I tested. So I don't test in animals. I test in humans. That was my collaborator. And what I tested in humans was very, very similar as well. I got humans to give electrical punishments to other people that they could speak with, or not speak with, see via a photo. So when two people interact, they can see each other's photo, and then they would be able to give shocks to each other. So the subjects that came into my lab, participants, and they were regular medical school students, engineering students, completely normal, not psychopathic. I did a few psychiatry profiling, and they were healthy individuals, and they came in and they behaved in an aggressive way, in such a way that normal people, like us, they started giving shocks to other people and enjoyed giving those shocks. And that was one of the most dramatic things, that these are the most, non-violent, students, young people. But if they can do it, other people can too. And just want to understand the behavior and why they would do something like that. And there's no ideology. So the idea of this research is that regardless of the ideology, you can always find a subset of people who will engage in violent behavior just for the fun of it. And ideology is just a primer, just a horse to ride on. And I did a lot of different things to add to my experiments. I measured facial muscle activity. I measured pulse and breathing rate. I measured sweat release, and I think that was one of the most wonderful things. Sweat release, and this is like a histogram of it. So as they would receive the shocks, instantly they would see an increase in the sweat. And this is another shock as well. So after going through this process a couple of times, they would anticipate the shock if they would receive it. And because they were anticipating, they know this person's going to give a shock, they had a sweat release before the shock even came. So we can condition people in any way that we like in the lab, and then we can make them give painful shocks to other people for no reason. And this is the idea that really, shakes people because you don't need an ideology. ISIS essentially is selecting people from all over the world who get fascinated by this idea of dreaming big, using violence to dream, to become this big personality, because they've all had very normal lives. And not to say that Omar Mateens are not there, but these guys are, these guys are the fringe, and the normal people are the norm, and they are the most of what constitutes the fighters and the terrorists, and whether it's the neo-Nazis, or whether the people that are lynching on the streets of India and Pakistan as well, or it's happening in the US and the Europe. So normal people, again, I will show you another experiment that was conducted in my lab. You can, I've blocked the person. The person will get a shock, and you will see how they will move. So this is how painful the electrical shock is, and this is how they're giving it to other people. So you'll just see. Okay, so they literally moved. They shook in such a way, and so this is incredibly painful. They're very angry when this happens to them. But it's not painful because it feels painful. They do it to themselves just to test it out first. And it's not bad. They're like, okay, it's painful, but I can take it. But when it comes from someone else, they're angry about it. And you condition them to an extent, and they're already giving shots 9 out of the 10 times to other people. And in some cases, there will be a subset of population who will want to give shocks without any reason, without this conditioning. And that is the appetitive aggression that I talk about. So I'm going to go through some of the stuff very quickly. Okay, so here is a number of shocks that people give in an appetitive way versus in a retaliatory way. You obviously know the retaliation, which is tit for tat. If you hurt me, I will give you a shock back. That's way more than other people. This is us. This is normal people who don't like to engage in violence. We are normal and healthy as well psychiatrically. But these are the number of people who gave shocks. They're healthy. They're just like us. But there is a subset of us who would want to behave like a terrorist, behave like a person who hurts other people just for the fun of it, without any provocation. There's a subset of us who would want to become the terrorists, and those are the people who get recruited into ideologies to behave in a certain way. Now, I'm skipping a lot of this because I think we're running out of time. But just one last thing before I end this. Some of the networks that we looked at in the brain had very similar properties to addiction network. And what we realized is that after doing so much research in both animals and humans, that this type of aggression is very, the network of the aggression. I mean, these are all the brain areas: prefrontal cortex, periaqueductal gray, and there's, a lot of conversation is happening. But this is the middle area where, the hypothalamus and those kind of deep brain structures are. This is where it all starts, and then it talks to the frontal cortex, goes back into the deep areas, and so on and so forth. Now, this circuit is very unique to aggression, but it's also very unique to addiction. So what we're trying to say is that because the overlap between aggression and addiction is so high, that this appetitive type of aggression, this terrorist type of aggression, is almost like addiction. And why I'm putting this out is that we know that people who've joined Al-Qaeda, and there's a lot of militants who've come to Kashmir as well, they've all gone from ideology to ideology, jumping from one place to another. Al-Qaeda, ISIS, they've gone to Chechnya, they've gone to Bosnia, they've come to Kashmir, they go to Afghanistan now. So what they call it, in the language of the extremists, it's called cult hopping. So they're doing a lot of cult hopping, and it's exactly the same in the neo-Nazis as well. They form groups in the 90s, and they jump from ideology to ideology, and finally they end up somewhere, depending on who they're fine with. But the most amount of fights that they actually do is infighting, is within groups. You remember the Al-Nusra Front and how the ISIL back then was fighting the Al-Nusra Front, and the majority of the casualties happened was actually them fighting between each other, rather than them fighting the coalition forces or the Syrian military. So it's very much like addiction. They use the drug, they go through abstinence, and they go into relapse. So aggression, they go into abstinence in some sort of a camp or de-radicalization center, which doesn't work because this research hasn't been used into um, that kind of de-radicalization program. And because of that, majority of the people come out of these de-radicalization centers, whether it's Abu Ghraib or any of these, other places, they end up becoming, relapsing back into aggression and engaging in more terrorist crimes. So this is data from American prisons, how majority of the American prisoners who've engaged in violent crimes have been engaging in other crimes after being released. So detention and imprisonment is not working on these guys. Yeah, I mean, this is a lot of machine learning and artificial intelligence I've used. I'm going to skip a lot of this because I don't think this is the space for that. This is brain areas that have been isolated and highlighted to see what is active at what point in time. Again, I'm going to skip it. A lot of the very basic science stuff. But you'll just see the breadth of the research that is going into this kind of, this kind of work, and seeing how many of these areas that I talked about are responsible for this behavior. I think that's pretty much the end of the talk, and I think yeah, I would like to kind of finish up by saying that yeah, so a lot of these people also have been traumatized and having reached in PTSD like situations because of what they've experienced in, say, Abu Ghraib, or whether it's Iraq or Iran. They've got a lot of grievances, not just grievances, but a lot of them now also have a lot of trauma because of what they've experienced. And trauma in particular, when joined with combat training, also gives this type of aggressive people, which now we call terrorists. So now we have another layer of that, where it's not just other people's grievances. It's not just somewhere in America or Canada or Australia is seeing serial civil war and joining ISIS. They actually have experiences themselves now. Their kids have experiences. So there's another layer. I mean, what we're seeing in Kashmir, there's layers of layers and generations of trauma that they've experienced, being, felt like they've been imprisoned in this long situation. So, and then if someone picks up, and they become an extremist and engage in violent activities, it's probably because of what they've experienced as a traumatic event, and then when they've got combat training. So I'm not saying that everybody who experiences trauma will become a terrorist, but if people experience trauma and then they get combat training, they're more likely to be the extremist than any other individual that we will find. And these are also normal people. They don't have any major psychiatric disorders except for the PTSD, the trauma that they have. I think I would like to finish with future directions. I'm doing a lot of stuff now in some of the American war veterans. We actually didn't start this year because of the corona and the pandemic. Their major problem, they've identified the problem in American war veterans. The major problem is sleep depression, sleep disruption, but the other thing is also aggression. They have been engaged in a lot of violent domestic crimes, domestic, not just to women, but also to children. I'm doing a lot of other fear and reward related stuff with other animals. I've got collaborations over to Seattle with whom I'm going to do some of this work in mice. And here in Sweden, I've also going to start some PTSD individuals who have not engaged in combat, to see how little they are, they're rarely aggressive because they don't have combat training, just to see how the combat training compares, in traumatic individuals. And ongoingly, I mean, I'm obviously writing the book. It's called Violent Brains of Ordinary Individuals. And just want to show how completely normal people, people like us, we're not the bad apples. We're, people like us are just, good apples put in the bad barrel, as you could see, and only like a small amount of us, say 19% of a subset of the population, normal. When I say us, as in the normal healthy population of the world, a small amount of us can become terrorists or aggressive. And we have to, there's no way that we can find who they are apart from biology. And all the terrorism research on ideology and this and that, it's fine, but none of that is going to help them rehabilitate or de-radicalize. And if there is some effort going into de-radicalization, I can understand people are using ideology and Islam as well, but that will help them de-radicalize. Is that going to stop their violence? That is something that will always remain a question. And if that is something that people want to address, people should essentially be going back to neuroscience and some of this kind of research that me and my colleagues have conducted. So I think I'm going to end here. I've got some people that I've collaborated with throughout. This guy is Professor Håkon Olausen. He's my boss. He's a PhD MD, and he's the head of my department. He's a collaborator in Seattle. I can hear my own voice. He's a collaborator in Seattle. His name is Assistant Professor Sam Golden. He's one of my closest friends who I work with, and he's Jewish. He's also very interested in some of why people engage in violent crimes because of this shared history of the Holocaust. And then I have my research assistant, Matthias Savalanti. And on that note, I thank you all for listening so keenly and carefully, and sorry about going over time. I know this is a very broad topic that we've been trying to kind of go through, but hoping that some of this would have.
Yeah, I think we have lost your voice.
Sorry?
Yeah, I think now we can hear you, yes.
Okay, so I'm hoping that this research would have given you a lot of questions, and also kind of this also this understanding that what we're doing in terms of terrorism research, or even to combat terrorism, is just using ideology or religion or nationalism and patriotism, but that's something that could change their ideology, but it's not going to change their behavior, because behavior is inherently rooted in the biology. And if you want to change people's behavior, violent behavior in particular, you have to go back to biological research. So yeah, thank you everybody for this time, and I'm looking forward to hearing if any of you have any questions for me.
Thanks a lot, Sumaiya. That was a fascinating talk.